On my wedding day, the seat reserved for my mother stayed empty, and while I walked down the aisle smiling for the cameras, a guest's phone lit up with a photo that punched the air out of my lungs. My mother in Santorini, her arm looped through the man I once planned to marry. I'm Madison Carter, and that was the moment I knew this day would not be remembered for my vows, but for the betrayal that changed everything. The lobby doors of the Willamette Grand swung open, and the rush of warm air met me as I stepped inside, the soft click of my heels swallowed by the plush carpet. The crystal chandeliers overhead threw prisms of light across the ballroom, catching on the polished silverware and the sequined dresses of guests already sipping champagne. I smoothed the skirt of my ivory gown with one hand and clutched the bouquet with the other, forcing my lips into what I hoped looked like a smile. I kept my gaze forward as the wedding coordinator guided me toward the aisle, but my eyes betrayed me. They darted to the right, toward the row reserved for my family. My father sat stiffly in the first seat, his expression a practiced mask, and beside him my Aunt Margot adjusted the pearls at her throat. 2 chairs down there was a gap, the one that had been draped with white satin, and a single rose for my mother. Empty. The music swelled, and the murmurs around me faltered, replaced by a ripple of silence that crawled up my spine. I told myself she was late, that she would appear any second with some dramatic entrance, maybe a flustered apology. But the pit in my stomach was already tightening. Halfway down the aisle, I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere to my left. A rustle of fabric. A young woman in a pale blue dress stood near the back, holding her phone out awkwardly, as if unsure whether to approach me. Our eyes met, and she stepped forward, her expression almost apologetic. I paused, bouquet trembling, and leaned slightly as she held the phone toward me. On the screen, bright Mediterranean sunlight spilled over whitewashed buildings and a sapphire sea. There was my mother Evelyn, her hair loose around her shoulders, skin golden from the sun. Her arm was threaded through the elbow of a man in a linen shirt, his head bent toward hers in what could only be described as intimate. Liam Brooks. The name slammed into my chest, harder than the sight itself. Liam. My Liam. The man I once imagined standing exactly where Nathan stood today. 3 years gone without a word, and now here he was grinning with my mother like they'd been in love for decades. Beneath the photo in bold letters, someone had tagged it, "Love in Paradise." My pulse roared in my ears. The weight of the bouquet seemed to double, and the air in the ballroom grew thick, oppressive. Every set of eyes felt trained on me, waiting for some reaction. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift a brittle curve that probably looked nothing like a real smile. "Thank you," I murmured to the woman, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I stepped back into motion, each step heavier than the last. The music picked up again as if nothing had happened, but the notes felt jagged wrong. Nathan was at the altar, his expression soft and warm, but I could barely focus on him. My mind kept replaying that image, the tilt of Liam's head, the way my mother's hand rested against his chest. The betrayal layered itself like ice over my ribs. When I reached Nathan, he took my free hand and squeezed it. "You okay, Mads?" He searched my face, brow furrowed. I nodded once. "Fine." The officiant began to speak, but the words blurred. My gaze flickered again to the family row, to that empty satin-covered chair. All I could think was that somewhere across the world, on the day I had dreamed about since I was a little girl, my mother was drinking wine on a balcony, with the man who had broken my heart. I drew in a long, slow breath, steadying the tremor in my hands. The ceremony continued, voices and laughter filling the space, but inside me, there was only a cold, still place where shock had settled in. When Nathan slid the ring onto my finger, I smiled again, for the guests, for the photos, for the illusion. But I knew that when the music faded and the toasts were done, the real story of this day would not be about vows or love. It would be about the empty chair, the photograph on a stranger's phone, and the silent vow I made to myself in that moment. I would not let this go unanswered. The applause from the ceremony still echoed faintly in my ears as Nathan and I slipped into the quiet of the bridal suite. My cheeks ached from smiling. My hands trembled just enough for me to notice, and the weight of what I had seen earlier pressed down on my chest like a stone. Nathan poured 2 glasses of champagne, set one in front of me, and kissed my forehead. I thanked him softly, pretending the day was unfolding exactly as we had planned. But the moment he stepped out to speak to the photographer, I set the glass aside untouched. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the noise from the ballroom fade. Without warning, a memory surged forward, sharp and uninvited. It was the first day of sophomore year at Columbia School of Fine Arts in Portland. I was hurrying across the quad arms full of sketchbooks when a gust of wind caught the top one and sent it tumbling. He caught it before it hit the ground. Liam Brooks. Wavy dark hair, camera slung across his chest, paint smudged on his forearm, like he had been in the middle of creating something important. He handed me the sketchbook with a crooked smile that made me forget whatever I had been rushing to. From that day on, we were inseparable. We spent hours in dimly lit coffee shops, sketching strangers, or editing photos on his laptop. We talked about opening a shared gallery one day, maybe somewhere along the Oregon coast, where the light was perfect year-round. He called me Maddie. I called him a dreamer, and I meant it as the highest compliment. My mother never saw it that way. Evelyn Carter was a woman who measured worth in numbers and last names. Liam came from a working-class family outside. Eugene paid his way through school by shooting weddings and senior portraits. She told me more than once that he was charming, but lacked ambition, as if ambition could only be proven through a corner office or a trust fund. At first I defended him, insisting his work would take off, that his eye for beauty was rare. But her disapproval chipped away at us. She would make comments over dinner when he was out of earshot, or worse, she would pretend to forget his name. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she looked at him, like he was something temporary. The pressure grew heavier in my final semester. My internship at a high-end design firm led to a job offer, and Evelyn made it clear she thought Liam had no place in that picture. She hinted that she might help me invest in my own business one day, but only if I made smart choices. It was never spoken outright, but the implication was there, constant and suffocating. One rainy Thursday in May, I came home to find his side of the closet empty. No note, no call, just gone. I searched for answers for weeks, calling mutual friends, visiting places we used to go, but it was as if he had been erased from the city. Eventually I told myself it was his choice, that I had to respect it. But the absence left a hollow in me I couldn't fill. If there was one thing I could control, it was my career. I poured myself into work, and with a seed investment from my grandmother Margaret Hayes, I launched Carter & Company Interiors. My days blurred into client meetings, mood boards, and construction site visits. My name started to mean something in Portland's design circles. I told myself I was over him, that I had built something that could never be taken away. 2 years later, I walked into the annual Portland Arts Gala, a fundraiser for local galleries. I was there to network, wearing a silk dress the color of deep wine and heels that pinched my toes. I was scanning the room when I saw him. Liam across the gallery floor, camera hanging from his neck, laughing at something a curator had said. My chest tightened, but my feet moved before my brain caught up. I told myself I would just say hello, be polite, and walk away. Then I saw her. Evelyn in a floor-length black gown, moving toward him with the grace of someone who knew she was being watched. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, leaned in, and said something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was made him laugh, that same laugh that used to belong to me. Then his hand settled on the small of her back, a touch that lingered a second too long. I froze. The noise of the gala dulled, until all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe she was thanking him for photographing the event. Maybe it was nothing. I clung to that possibility like a lifeline, forcing myself to look away and smile at someone who recognized me from a magazine feature. But the image had already lodged itself deep inside me, a splinter I refused to acknowledge. Now sitting in my bridal suite, the memory looped itself with cruel clarity. It had been easy then to dismiss, to bury under work and polite denial. Today stripped away every defense I had built. There was no mistaking what I had seen on that phone in the aisle, no rewriting it into something harmless. Nathan's voice came from the doorway, calling me back to the present. "They're ready for us to make our entrance for the reception." I stood, smoothed my dress, and nodded. The applause from the guests rose as we stepped back into the ballroom. I smiled for the cameras, accepted hugs, listened to toasts that blurred together. All the while, the empty chair at the family table burned in my peripheral vision, and the picture of Santorini hovered in my mind, bright and sharp against the dim light of the room. The day had only just begun, but I knew this was no longer only a wedding celebration. It was the opening scene of something far more complicated, and I intended to see exactly where it would lead. By the time Nathan and I left the Willamette Grand, it was close to midnight. The car ride was quiet, both of us drained from the endless smiling, the toasts, the small talk. The moment we stepped into the penthouse, I kicked off my heels and let them fall where they landed. Nathan went to hang up his jacket, humming softly under his breath, while I sank into the velvet sofa and let the city lights wash over me through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The phone on the coffee table lit up the name Grandma Margaret flashing on the screen. I answered quickly, expecting congratulations, maybe some warmth to end the night. Her voice came low, careful, as if someone might overhear, even though she was 3 states away. "This is not just about feelings, Maddie." I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. Before I could ask her to explain, she said she would call me in the morning when she could speak more freely, then hung up. The unease settled like a stone in my stomach. I was still holding the phone when the doorbell rang. Chloe Martinez stood there, coat unbuttoned, a bottle of wine in one hand, and a look on her face that made my chest tighten. I let her in, and she immediately set the wine down without opening it. "You've seen it right." She didn't wait for an answer, pulling her phone from her pocket and turning the screen toward me. It was the same photo from earlier, but now cropped tighter, my mother's laugh frozen mid-breath, Liam's hand on her hip. The headline from a gossip site screamed across the top, pairing their names with words like scandal and affair. Below it in smaller text was a figure. The trip's estimated cost, $65,000. I felt my jaw tighten. That number wasn't just obscene, it was impossible for her to spend without dipping into something more than her own accounts. My voice came out flat. "Where did they get that figure?" Chloe hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. "I got a message tonight from Ryan Blake. You remember him? He works in compliance at Northwest Heritage Bank. He saw a withdrawal flagged for review earlier this week." I stared at her, barely breathing. She unfolded the paper and slid it across the coffee table. In neat handwriting, Ryan had written out the details. 65,000 transferred from an investment account under the name Madison Carter, co-managed by Evelyn Carter. The air seemed to drain from the room. I reached for the paper, reading it twice, 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange into something less damning. That account was my grandmother's gift, set up when I graduated, intended as a safety net while I built my business. I had never touched it except to review the quarterly statements. Chloe was watching me carefully. "Maddie, this is theft. You know that, right?" I could hear the edge in her voice, the way she was already moving past disbelief into planning. I shook my head slowly, still trying to connect the dots. My mother hadn't just chosen to be with Liam on my wedding day. She had funded their little paradise with my money. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my palm to the cold glass. Below, the streets were nearly empty traffic lights, cycling through their colors without a soul to witness them. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hard-eyed. Nathan stepped out from the bedroom, tie loosened, sensing the shift in the air. "Everything okay?" I turned, folding the paper in my hand before he could see it. "Just a work thing," I said, the lie tasting bitter. I wasn't ready to explain this to him, not tonight. Not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Chloe caught my eye and gave the faintest nod. She understood. She knew I needed time. She grabbed her coat and left quietly, leaving the wine behind. When the door closed, I sat back on the sofa and unfolded the paper again. The handwriting blurred for a moment, then sharpened. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice from earlier warning me. This was not just about feelings. She had been right. I leaned back, the city lights stretching far beyond the glass, and felt the shift inside me. Whatever came next would not be about hurt pride or family betrayal. This was about something tangible, something that could be proven, something that could be taken back. I set the paper down on the coffee table next to the untouched champagne Nathan had poured hours ago, and let the silence of the penthouse wrap around me. The night was over, but the real work had just begun. By Monday morning, I was sitting in the corner office of Helen Price, a glass wall behind her, framing the gray sweep of the Willamette River. She was my grandmother's attorney for nearly 2 decades, a woman whose calm, measured tone could take the edge off the worst situations. Today, though, her eyes were sharp, scanning the folder I had slid across her desk. She flipped through the printed statements, pausing to make notes with a fountain pen. "You were right to bring this to me immediately. From what I can see, Evelyn may have accessed funds from more than one source." I leaned forward, hands clasped in my lap. "What do you mean, more than one source?" Helen adjusted her glasses. "When your parents divorced, your mother retained joint control of a marital investment account. Your father, Jason Carter, agreed to leave it untouched until you turned 30. Legally, part of that account is earmarked for you. If she moved money from there without consent, it's questionable at best." I felt my pulse pick up. "That's not the account Chloe mentioned, though." "No," Helen said, setting the divorce records aside and lifting a second stack of papers. "This is where it gets concerning." She tapped a highlighted line on a transaction summary. "Last Tuesday, there was a withdrawal of $65,000 from an account established in 2015 by Margaret Hayes for use specifically as a trust vehicle." I swallowed. "The account my grandmother set up after college?" "Exactly." Helen's voice stayed even, but her pen tapped twice on the page. "According to the trust documents, your mother retained co-manager status, likely because you were under 21 when it was created. Unless that authority was revoked later, she had legal access. But using it for personal travel with a companion is far outside the intended purpose." I closed my eyes briefly, the image of Santorini flashing in my mind again. She planned this. Helen's gaze softened slightly. "The timing is too precise to be coincidence. 1 week before your wedding, she empties a portion of your trust. That trip was paid for before you even walked down the aisle." I sat back, letting the weight of it settle. My mother hadn't just made a choice out of spite or impulsive romance. She had planned, financed, and executed it using my own resources. "What can we do?" I asked. Helen leaned forward, lacing her fingers. "First, we gather everything. I need full transaction histories for the last 6 months, from both the marital account and your trust. We will also want to check your business accounts just in case." That last part made my chest tighten. Carter and Compey Interiors was my pride, my stability. If she had touched that, I wasn't sure I could keep the anger contained. Helen slid a legal pad toward me. "Write down every account you know she has access to, past or present, even if you think it's closed." As I wrote, Helen moved to her computer and began drafting a formal request to the bank. The rhythmic click of her keyboard filled the room, steady and unrelenting. When I finished, she glanced at the list. "This will help. And Madison, keep this quiet for now. The less she knows we're watching, the better our position will be." I nodded, slipping the pen back into its holder. My phone buzzed in my bag, but I ignored it. Helen gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I'll have initial reports by Friday. In the meantime, go about your routine. If she thinks you're distracted with newlywed life, she won't anticipate a challenge." I stood, smoothing the sleeves of my blazer. "Thank you, Helen." Out in the hallway, the muted hum of the law firm's reception area felt almost too normal compared to the knot twisting in my stomach. The elevator ride down was silent, except for the soft chime of each floor. Outside, the wind off the river carried a chill, but it cleared my head. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking, each step a little more certain than the last. Evelyn had taken something from me, but she had also left a trail. And with Helen's help, I was going to follow it. The next afternoon, I caught a flight to Seattle, the kind of impulsive decision that left no room for excuses or second thoughts. The clouds hung low over the city as I made my way to a small cafe tucked between an antique bookstore and a florist on Pine Street. My father had agreed to meet me there, though his voice on the phone had been hesitant, almost guarded. Jason Carter was already seated when I walked in, a half-finished black coffee in front of him. He stood briefly, offering a quick hug that felt more like a formality than comfort. I slid into the chair across from him, the smell of roasted beans and rain-soaked pavement filling the air between us. "Thanks for coming," I said, though my tone carried more weight than gratitude. He nodded, eyes flicking to the window before meeting mine again. "I know why you're here." I folded my hands on the table. "Then let's not waste time. Did you know Mom took $65,000 from my trust account last week?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I did." The answer landed like a slap. "You knew." He exhaled slowly, looking down at his coffee. I didn't want to get in the middle of it. I leaned forward, the words sharp before I could temper them. "This isn't you getting in the middle of some petty argument. This is theft. This is my money." Jason's gaze shifted, a mix of guilt and resignation. "Your mother? She can be persuasive." I laughed, once short and humorless. "Persuasive. That's what we're calling it now. She's been manipulating you for years, and you're still letting her, even after the divorce." He flinched slightly but didn't argue. "I've tried to keep the peace, at my expense." I shook my head, the knot in my chest tightening. Keeping the peace isn't noble when it means standing by while someone hurts your own daughter. For a long moment he said nothing, the sound of milk steaming at the counter filling the silence. Then he looked up, something heavier in his expression. "She told me once. She said she'd do whatever it takes to make you learn humility." The words cut deeper than I expected. Learn humility. As if my success, my independence, were crimes she needed to punish. "When did she say that?" I asked, my voice low. "About a year ago, after she heard about that feature on your firm in Architectural Digest. She called me furious that you didn't thank her publicly for the startup money." I sat back, feeling the walls of the cafe close in. So this isn't about Liam. This isn't even about the wedding. This has been building for years. Jason's hand twitched toward mine but stopped short. "Maddie, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix $65,000 missing from my account. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you let it happen." He nodded slowly, accepting the blow. "If you want my help to get it back, I'll give you whatever information you need." I studied him, wondering if it was guilt or some flicker of paternal instinct finally surfacing. "What accounts does she have that I don't know about?" He glanced around the cafe, then lowered his voice. "There's a brokerage account in her name and a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of Northwest Heritage. I don't know what's in it, but she's guarded it for years." I filed the details away, my mind already working through how to confirm them without tipping her off. Jason checked his watch, the gesture more habit than necessity. "I know I've failed you in a lot of ways. I just thought maybe staying out of it was better than making things worse." "You were wrong," I said quietly. "Sometimes silence is the worst choice you can make." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I'll send you the account information tonight." We finished our coffees in silence, the rain outside tapping against the window like a steady metronome. When we stood to leave, his hug lingered a fraction longer, but it didn't erase the sting of what he'd admitted. Out on the sidewalk, I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the gray blur of the city. The conversation had given me more than I expected, but also confirmed something I had known for a long time. I couldn't rely on him to protect me from her. That was going to be my job and mine alone. 2 days later, I was in my office at Carter & Company Interiors when my assistant knocked on the door, her expression tight. She set a printed email on my desk, the subject line already making my stomach clench. "Termination of contract, Seaside Grand Resort." I scanned the letter, twice the formal language, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Effective immediately, the project was canceled. No breach of contract cited, just a vague statement about a change in direction. The Seaside Grand deal had been one of our largest this quarter, a full redesign of their Florida property. Losing it would leave a visible dent in our revenue. Before I could reach for my phone, Chloe appeared in the doorway holding her tablet like a loaded weapon. "I think I know why." She closed the door behind her and sat across from me, swiping to an email thread. "One of my contacts in the hospitality group forwarded this. Grant Mitchell's assistant received a call last week from Evelyn. She told him that you were under significant personal and financial stress, implying it might delay the project or cause reputational issues." I could feel the heat rise in my face. "So she's not content with taking my money. Now she's sabotaging my business. Chloe nodded grimly. I reached out to Grant's office myself. They confirmed the decision was influenced by a trusted source. That's their phrasing, not mine. My chair scraped against the hardwood as I stood. Where's the next industry networking event? She didn't even have to look. The Northwest Hospitality Alliance mixer. Tonight. Grant will be there. By the time evening fell, I was walking into the rooftop ballroom of the Fairmont Cascade, the city lights glittering beyond the glass walls. The hum of conversation and the clink of cocktail glasses filled the space. I spotted Grant near the bar, talking to two other men in tailored suits. I waited for a break in their conversation before stepping forward. Mr. Mitchell Madison Carter. He looked at me like he'd been expecting this. Ms. Carter, good evening. His handshake was polite but perfunctory. I understand you decided to terminate our contract, I said, keeping my voice even. I'd like to know why. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It's nothing personal. I just can't risk entanglement in complicated family matters. I blinked at him, the words sharper than he probably intended. So you're willing to forego a project worth 6 figures because of gossip? Grant's jaw tightened slightly. When the gossip comes from someone I've known for 20 years, I take it seriously. That someone being my mother. He didn't confirm, but the lack of denial was enough. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Whatever she told you is designed to hurt me, not protect you. My work stands on its own. You've seen my portfolio. You know I deliver. His gaze held mine for a moment, weighing something I couldn't read. If you can resolve whatever this is, make it clear it won't bleed into our project, I'll reconsider. Until then, my decision stands. I nodded once, the conversation clearly over. Enjoy your evening, I said, then turned before he could respond. Chloe was waiting by the balcony doors, reading my face before I spoke. He's not budging, not until I clean up the mess Evelyn's made. Then we clean it up, she said simply. The city stretched out below us, the lights shimmering like a challenge I hadn't yet answered. This was no longer just about getting my money back. She was coming for my career, and I was not going to let her win. The message came late on a Thursday night, while I was reviewing project sketches in my living room. It was a direct message on Instagram from someone named Daniel Brooks. The last name stopped me cold. He introduced himself as Liam's younger brother and asked if we could meet in person. Said it was about something I needed to know. By Saturday afternoon, I was walking into a quiet coffee shop in Capitol Hill, the kind of place where the music was low and the tables were far enough apart for privacy. A tall man with sandy hair and a leather jacket stood as I approached. He had Liam's eyes, but none of his arrogance. Madison, he said, offering a firm handshake. I appreciate you coming. I sat across from him, studying his face for any hint of a setup. Why reach out to me now? He looked down for a moment, then back up. Because I can't watch him do this anymore. Liam isn't with your mother because of love. He's with her because she's funding his lifestyle. The trips, the clothes, the cameras, all of it. I didn't flinch, though. The words scraped against old wounds. I figured as much. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone, scrolling before handing it to me. On the screen was a string of messages between Liam and a friend. The tone was smug, almost gloating. In one, he wrote about how Evelyn was going to bankroll a photography tour across Europe, all expenses paid, and how it would open doors to galleries. My grip tightened on the phone. So he's using her. Daniel nodded. And she's letting him because it makes her feel important. But that's not why I really asked you here. He pulled up a different photo. It was a clear shot of a contract, the top bearing Evelyn's signature, alongside that of a man named Charles Whitmore. The letterhead was from a property management firm I recognized as handling several high-value family assets. Where did you get this? I asked. Liam left his camera bag at my place after Thanksgiving. I was looking for my charger and found his backup SD card. He'd taken photos of the contract during one of his trips with her. I think he planned to use it somehow, maybe as leverage. I studied the image, my mind cataloging the details. The contract referenced a transfer of partial ownership in a beachfront property on Whidbey Island. a property my grandmother had once told me would be passed down to me. This is a family asset. She has no right to move it without my consent. Daniel leaned in, lowering his voice. Then you need to act fast, because from what Liam told a friend, the deal's set to close before the end of the month. I slid his phone back across the table. Why are you helping me? Because he's my brother, but that doesn't mean I agree with him. And because my mom raised me to believe that taking advantage of people, especially family, is wrong. I nodded slowly, weighing the sincerity in his voice. I'll need copies of those files. He handed me a small flash drive. Already done. When we stepped outside, the winter air cut sharp against my cheeks. Daniel shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. I don't know what you're planning to do with it, but be careful. Evelyn's not the type to back down quietly. Neither am I. He gave a brief nod before walking toward a silver pickup parked across the street. I watched him drive away, the weight of the flash drive in my pocket pressing against my leg like a loaded question. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, contract zoomed in. Every clause, every signature was a thread, and I intended to pull until the whole thing unraveled. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about stopping her before she could erase my place in the family entirely. I stared at the contract on my laptop screen until the numbers blurred, then reached for my phone. My thumb hovered for a second before I hit call. Evelyn answered on the third ring, her voice smooth, almost amused. Madison, what a surprise. I cut straight to it. I know about the Whidbey Island property. I know you signed it over to Charles Whitmore. There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture her in some sunlit villa, holding the phone with one hand and a glass of wine in the other. You think you know, she said finally, but you don't understand the full picture. I understand enough. That property was promised to me. You don't have the right. Her laugh was soft and condescending. You'll understand when you're my age. There are things you have to do to secure your future. My grip tightened around the phone. Is that what you call it now? Securing your future? You've been doing this for years, taking what isn't yours. You destroyed what I had with Liam, and now you're parading him around like some trophy. Her voice sharpened. That boy was never going to give you the life you deserved. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. And now he's the one giving you the life you want. Or is it the other way around? A brittle silence filled the line. When she spoke again, her tone was cold. Be careful, Madison. If you make this bigger than it needs to be, I'll have no problem selling my share in the Lake Union apartments too. My pulse kicked hard in my throat. That's a joint investment, I said. You can't just— I can, she interrupted. And I will if you force my hand. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint rush of waves in the background, probably from some balcony in Santorini. I pictured her there with Liam sipping champagne while she calculated her next move. You've made your choice, I said finally. And so have I. She exhaled like I was a child throwing a tantrum. You'll see in time that I've been right all along. I ended the call without another word and set the phone down on the table. My reflection in the darkened laptop screen looked back at me, jaw-set eyes sharper than they'd been in weeks. The threat was clear, but so was my resolve. Outside, the city lights flickered in the cold night air. I closed the contract file and opened a new document starting a list of every property account and asset Evelyn had her hands in. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure I knew the board better than she did. We gathered in Margaret's library on a rainy Saturday morning, the kind of steady gray drizzle that made the whole city feel hushed. Helen had spread folders across the long oak table, each labeled with a property name, account number, or date. Chloe arrived with her laptop, Daniel with a thermos of coffee, and Margaret already seated at the head of the table like a judge ready to hear a case. Helen tapped a folder in front of her. This is everything we know so far. The Whidbey Island property, the Lake Union apartments, the trust account your grandmother set up, and 2 investment portfolios. Evelyn's name appears on all of them. I glanced at the neat stacks of paper. It felt like preparing for trial, every piece of evidence waiting to be placed in the right order. Chloe clicked through her screen. I've got media contacts lined up. If we decide to go public, we control the narrative. But that's only if you want to take it that far. Daniel leaned forward. She's not going to back down without pressure. Public exposure might be the only thing she understands. Margaret's voice was calm but firm. Let's not underestimate her ability to twist the story. We need the legal angle solid before anything else. Helen nodded and slid a thinner folder toward me. I went through the divorce agreement between your parents again. There's a clause most people would miss. If Evelyn uses any marital asset for personal purposes, without written consent from all legal heirs, she's required to reimburse the full value adjusted for inflation, plus damages. My eyes locked on the wording, the black letters crisp against the page. That's enforceable. Absolutely, Helen said. But we'll need proof that the trip with Liam and any related expenses came from those assets and that it was purely personal. Chloe grinned. We have the photos, the bank transfers, and Daniel's messages. That's a start. Daniel shifted in his chair. I can also testify about what Liam told me. He bragged about how she was covering everything from the flights to the hotels. Margaret's gaze moved around the table. Then the question becomes how we want to proceed. Quietly and directly, or with enough force that she can't wriggle free. I traced the edge of the contract with my finger. If we go quiet, she'll try again in a year. If we go loud, we risk backlash. But I'm done playing defense. Helen started mapping out steps on a legal pad. First, we file a preliminary notice to freeze any transactions on the assets in question. Second, we serve her with a demand for accounting. Third, we prepare a civil suit citing the divorce clause. Chloe added, and in parallel, I'll draft a press release that stays vague but hints at financial misconduct. Just enough to make certain people think twice about doing business with her. Daniel passed me a USB drive. More messages from just last week. He's planning another trip with her in spring, this time to Italy. She's paying for it out of an account tied to the Lake Union apartments. I slipped the drive into my bag. Every new detail tightened the net. Margaret leaned back in her chair, eyes sharper than I'd seen in years. When I gave you that trust fund, it was to build your future, not to finance her whims. If she wants a fight, she'll have it. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the tall windows. The table was covered in the tools of war contracts, emails, bank statements, photographs. Helen was already drafting the first freeze notice. Chloe was on her phone with a contact at a real estate trade publication. Daniel was scanning more messages into the evidence folder. By the time we broke for lunch, the plan was set. The first legal papers would be filed Monday morning. The press would get their whispers by Wednesday if she didn't respond. I stood by the window looking out at the wet streets below. It wasn't just preparation anymore. It was the first move. And once it started, there would be no turning back. The Fairmont ballroom shimmered with crystal light and the hum of conversation. Waiters in black vests moved between tables, trays balanced high, the air heavy with the scent of white roses and expensive perfume. I walked in beside Margaret, her pearl necklace catching every glint from the chandeliers, with Helen and Chloe just behind us. It was a night designed for appearances, and we intended to make ours count. Every table was filled with people who knew our names, our family history, our connections. Some smiled warmly, others watched with the polite curiosity reserved for a brewing scandal. I could feel eyes tracking us as we made our way toward the center of the room. Margaret leaned in slightly. Hold your head high. She wants to believe you're rattled. Don't give her that. Across the room, Evelyn stood in a cluster of guests wearing a silver gown and an expression of effortless charm. Liam was nowhere in sight. She hadn't seen me yet. Chloe's gaze slid toward a corner where two reporters from the Seattle Times stood, their press badges barely visible under tailored jackets. It happened seamlessly. Chloe drifted away under the pretense of greeting someone, then positioned herself within earshot of the reporters. From her clutch, she produced a slim envelope, tilting it just enough for the nearest one to glimpse the tab of printed photographs inside. I watched the man's posture change, curiosity sharpening his features. Within minutes, they had the packet in hand, glossy shots of Evelyn and Liam strolling hand in hand along a Santorini promenade, laughing over wine, the sun turning the water gold. Attached were excerpts of financial statements, transactions matching the dates of the trip funds, traced directly to accounts bearing my name. The first murmur reached my ears like the start of a slow wave. Heads began to turn. A woman in sapphire silk whispered to her husband, his eyebrows shooting up before he glanced toward Evelyn. Evelyn must have sensed the shift. She turned, scanning the room, her smile faltering for half a second before she caught sight of me. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. One of the reporters stepped forward, polite but direct. "Mrs. Carter, do you have any comment on the allegations regarding misappropriation of family assets for personal travel?" The surrounding guests froze in that social way, where bodies remain relaxed, but every ear is tuned to the exchange. Evelyn's laugh was light, dismissive. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed. People love to invent stories." The second reporter held up a page from the packet. "This is a bank statement from an account registered under your daughter's name. The withdrawals match the cost of your trip to Greece last month. Care to explain?" Her denial sharpened. "I don't discuss private family matters at public events. That will be all." She made to turn away, but Helen, standing at my side, spoke just loud enough to carry. "Unless, of course, those matters involve breach of legal agreements." Gasps rippled through the nearest tables. Evelyn's eyes locked on Helen, then flicked to Margaret, who stood serene and unflinching. A man from the charities board approached, concern etched on his face. "Evelyn, perhaps we should step aside and clarify this. It's attracting attention." She straightened her shoulders. "There's nothing to clarify. My daughter is overreacting." Chloe appeared at my elbow, her phone in hand. "Seattle. Now just push the story live. It's trending already." The room's energy shifted from polite discomfort to open fascination. Conversations restarted in low, rapid bursts. A few guests discreetly pulled out their phones under the table. Evelyn's circle had dissolved, leaving her standing with only two acquaintances who looked increasingly uneasy. Margaret touched my arm. "We've made the point. Don't push further here. Let the proof work for itself." I nodded, but my gaze stayed on Evelyn. She was cornered in a way she hadn't anticipated, the control she prized so much slipping in front of the very people she sought to impress. By the time the charity auction began, whispers had replaced polite chatter entirely. I could feel the weight of every glance, every sideways look cast in her direction. The tide had turned, and it had started in this very room. The conference room on the 24th floor was all glass and sharp edges, the kind of space where nothing could hide. Helen sat beside me, a slim folder in front of her, her pen perfectly aligned with the legal pad. Across the table, Evelyn adjusted the cuff of her cream blazer, as if this were a casual brunch instead of a legal mediation. The mediator, a gray-haired man with a voice like polished stone, opened with the standard preamble. "We're here to find an amicable resolution." Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm willing to return a portion of the money and keep my share of the Lake Union apartments. That should settle this matter without unnecessary escalation." Helen didn't glance at me. She just slid the first page of our evidence across the table. The transaction history was in black and white, the dates and amounts impossible to argue. The mediator's eyes moved down the page, his expression tightening. "We also have records of unauthorized withdrawals from a trust established for my client by her grandmother in 2015, Helen said. "And per the divorce agreement you signed with Jason Carter, any use of joint family assets for personal purposes requires written consent from all named heirs." Evelyn's jaw flexed. That clause was never meant for situations like this. Helen's tone remained even. "The language is clear. You breached the agreement." I added quietly. "You didn't just take money, you used it to finance a trip with someone who once promised to marry me." Her eyes flicked to mine, the faintest crack in her composure. "That's irrelevant." "It's not to me," I said, "and it's not to the court if we take it there." The mediator leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, the documentation is thorough. Prolonging this will only increase legal fees and public exposure." For the first time that morning, Evelyn looked cornered. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table before she let out a breath. "Fine, I'll return the $65,000. And Helen added sign over your share of the Lake Union apartments to Madison." Evelyn's head snapped toward her. "Absolutely not." "Then we proceed to court," Helen said calmly, closing the folder as if the matter were already decided. The silence stretched, the weight of it pressing against the glass walls. Finally, Evelyn's gaze slid to the mediator, then back to me. Her lips thinned. "I'll sign." The paperwork was drawn up on the spot. When the pen touched the signature line, I watched her name flow in ink, a quiet surrender after months of taking and undermining. By the end of the week, the funds had been wired back into my account, and the property transfer was complete. The balance felt almost anticlimactic, but then Chloe sent me a link. It was a social column, discreet but unmistakable. Evelyn Carter had been removed from the board of the Pacific Northwest Philanthropy Circle. Another headline followed 2 days later. Former Seattle socialite loses key charity roles amid financial scandal. The photos accompanying the articles were candid. Her face caught mid-expression, no trace of her usual polish. I didn't hear from Liam directly, but Daniel texted me late one night. "He's gone." Packed up and left her place without a word. The city seemed quieter without her shadow over me. Deals for Carter and Comey started flowing again, the Florida resort among the first to call back. Margaret visited my office one afternoon, standing at the window with a faint smile. "You did more than protect what was yours," she said. "You changed the rules of the game." I thought about Evelyn then, not in anger, but in the stark clarity that comes when a battle is over. Reputation had been her currency, and now the people she'd once held in her orbit had stepped back one by one. The woman who had tried to teach me humility had learned her own lesson, delivered not in whispers, but in full view of the world she valued most. Within weeks, Carter and Comey Interiors was busier than it had ever been. The phone calls were steady, the contracts coming in faster than we could print them. Grant Mitchell called personally to reinstate the Florida resort project, his voice warm with the kind of respect that had been absent before. I flew down for the signing, walking through the sunlit lobby, knowing this deal would anchor the company's growth for years to come. The money Evelyn had taken was back in my account, but it no longer felt like the main victory. That sum became seed capital for a full expansion. We opened a second office in San Diego, hired new designers, and landed 3 high-profile hospitality projects before summer's end. Clients looked at me differently now. Not as someone carrying the weight of family scandal, but as a woman who had navigated through it and built something stronger on the other side. One crisp October morning, I booked a ticket to Italy. It wasn't an escape, not this time. It was a choice I made entirely for myself. The idea of standing in Florence's Piazzale Michelangelo at sunrise, of tasting wine in the Tuscan hills, had been a quiet dream for years. Now it was on my calendar, paid for with my own success. Before I left, I stopped by Margaret's house. The maple trees in her garden were turning gold, their leaves drifting onto the stone path. She had the kettle on before I even sat down. We sipped Darjeeling in her sunroom, the light catching in her silver hair. "You did more than protect what was yours," she said, her voice steady. "You showed her you could live without her approval, without her shadow." I nodded, the truth of it settling somewhere deep. For so long I had been reacting to what Evelyn did, trying to fix or defend. Now I was simply living, and the people in my life were those who chose to be there without conditions. The trip to Italy was everything I had hoped for. I wandered cobblestone streets in Rome, lingered over long lunches in tiny trattorias, and watched the sun set over the Amalfi Coast. There was no urgency in my steps, no tension in my shoulders. Somewhere between the clink of wine glasses and the sound of church bells, I realized that the chapter with Evelyn was closed. When I returned to Seattle, I felt different. The office was thriving, my friendships intact, and the quiet in my life felt like peace instead of absence. I met Margaret for tea again, the air cool and bright. We didn't speak much of Evelyn, not because it hurt, but because she no longer occupied the space she once had in my mind. "If you were in my position, would you have chosen to forgive or to take back what was yours?" I know my answer, but I wonder how you would have written the ending.